Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. My name is Leonore Shikune, and I'm the Communications Director of the International Water Resources Association. So after the success of our first masterclass, which attracted over 140 participants last week, it is my absolute pleasure to be here today to extend a warm welcome to all of you for our second masterclass. On behalf of IWRA and our esteemed partners for this series, the Human Right to Water and South Africa's Water Research Commission, I would like to extend a heartfelt welcome to all the participants who have joined us once again. So at IWRA, we believe that timely collaboration is essential to tackle the global water challenges of our time. Since 2021, we have hosted a series of masterclasses. These masterclasses are based on themes of timely interest in the water sector, and we collaborate with leading water institutions to offer an online series of masterclasses on these themes. Today, we're thrilled for this year's virtual masterclasses on institutional responsibility to support SDG-6 and the rights to water and sanitation. As we all know, access to clean water and sanitation is a fundamental human right. Yet this right is still not fully realized in many parts of the world. For those of you who are just joining us today, this masterclass series is designed to help authorities and businesses improve their relationships with the community and support sustainable development goals, specifically SDG-6. Moreover, the course will provide a practical approach for integrating a human rights-based approach to meet corporate sustainability due diligence standards. Lastly, I would like to encourage once again all of you to sign up for the workshops if you have not already, by becoming an IWRA member. By signing up, you'll not only gain access to all the masterclass workshops, but also unlock a range of exclusive benefits, such as discounted registration to future IWRA Congress events, or leading an IWRA task force or chapter. So please visit our website at www.iwra.org to learn more. Thank you for joining us and being a part of this invaluable opportunity. So without further ado, let us embark on this enriching journey together as we explore and discuss the vital issues around SDG-6 and the rights to water and sanitation. So I'll now hand over to my colleague, Dr. Petty Obani, who will be leading today's masterclass. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lina, and warm welcome again to everyone. My name is Petty Obani. I'm an associate professor of law in the School of Law, University of Bradford, and I'm really delighted to be here with you today. We'll run through a few slides which mainly cover the relationship between human rights to water and sanitation and SDG-6. So to give us a bit of a background, last week at the first masterclass, we looked into investments in the rights-based approach. And for that, there was a brief introduction to SDG-6 and human rights. We considered some of the challenges to achieving equitable access to water and sanitation. We also considered the responsibilities for business, water authorities, utilities, and ministries to protect the human rights to water and sanitation. There was a discussion around the business case for taking a human rights-based approach, as well as indicators for improving sustainability. So for today, we're going to be focused a bit more around how the rights to water and sanitation and the SDGs, especially SDG 6.1 and 2, come together and what role corporate due diligence laws can play in advancing the realization of the rights to water and sanitation in our various jurisdictions. One of the things I'd like us to do, if possible, please, is to just include in front of your name on Zoom whether you are a regulator. So if you're a regulator, just add R. And then if you're a researcher or someone who's into academia, anything along those lines where you actually do research on water and sanitation, or indeed corporate due diligence, I'd like you to please add R before your name. And then if you are a utility company, service provider, then please add S before your name. And for anyone who's more from a community-based organization, an NGO, please add C before your name. The idea is just to give us an inkling of who's in the room. And when we go into the workshop later today, we'll also be trying to have discussions that involve people from these different sectors or these different areas. So just a bit of a background in terms of access to water and sanitation in numbers. I think most of us already know that there is a big gap in access to sanitation as well as access to water. And as we look into the numbers, we find that those who are in the most vulnerable situations are very often those who are left without access. Very recently, we experienced the COVID-19 pandemic, and that in itself exposed the fault lines, the difficulties which people in vulnerable situations have in accessing water and sanitation. And it also exposed the risks and indeed the critical need to ensure that there's universal access. Because during COVID-19 pandemic, not only was access to water and safe sanitation important as a way of preventing the spread of the virus, but it was also an important way of ensuring that people who were sick were able to recover, and there was also a break in the transmission from one person to the other. So access to water and sanitation is really important, and we cannot emphasize enough the need to ensure that there's universal coverage. Now, why does this matter for institutions? Because of course we know that it's a human right, and so it's important for us as individuals, but why should this matter for institutions? It's important for institutions because whether it's a company, whether it's a third sector institution, whether it's a government body, a broad range of institutions, you find that it is actually important because there is the reputational damage that comes with the problems which exist or which result when we do not have access to water and sanitation in corporate settings. There's also loss of productive hours as a result of people falling sick because they do not have access to safe drinking water and sanitation. There are also issues around pollution of water and land and other natural resources. There's morbidity. There's the impact on culture and well-being. There's also the financial aspects of it, economic losses linked to lack of access to water and sanitation. There is social unrest, there's mortality, there are the impacts on the GDP. There are also impacts on gender, especially in relation to gender inequality and gender-based violence. So these are all examples of the ways in which lack of access to water and sanitation actually impact on various segments of the society. So a lot of the conversations are around health, but beyond health, there's an economic aspect, there's a social aspect, and there are developmental losses due to lack of access to water and sanitation that we all need to be mindful of. And these are some of the reasons for which it's important for institutions as well as individuals, communities to work together to improve access. Now, in terms of the evolution of the rights to water and sanitation, just to give us a bit of a background, the rights to water and sanitation have a history that is closely linked to the human rights framework, broadly speaking. And this diagram here shows the connections between various rights. And in the center, we have the rights to water. Now, the right to dignity, the rights to housing and food, the right to life, the right to health, the right to a healthy environment are all rights that are necessary for us to achieve the right to water. But at the same time, without the right to water and the right to sanitation, we cannot achieve these other rights as well. So they are all interdependent. Now, the right to water is in that diagram, but there's also the right to sanitation, because of course, we know that water and sanitation are very closely linked. Without sanitation, the chances that we will be experiencing water pollution, and that threatens our right to water. The right to sanitation has also evolved very closely with the right to water. So in 2010, we had the United Nations General Assembly resolution, which recognized the right to safe and clean drinking water and sanitation as a human right that is essential for the enjoyment of life as well as other human rights. Again, in the same year, we had the Human Rights Council reaching a similar resolution recognizing the right as well as indicating that the right is derived from the right to an adequate standard of living. But we've come a long way from 2010 when the conversation was around the right to water and sanitation, because by 2015, it was then recognized again that sanitation in itself is a distinct right. And this came through in the United Nations General Assembly resolution that was released in that year. So today we have conversations around not the right to water and sanitation or only about the right to water, but about the right to water as well as the right to sanitation. So two independent but linked rights. What's the right to water about? It's essentially a right that guarantees everyone without discrimination to have access to sufficient, safe, acceptable, physically accessible, as well as affordable water for personal and domestic users. Similarly, the right to sanitation entitles everyone without discrimination to have physical and affordable access to sanitation in all spheres of life. And that sanitation has to be safe, it needs to be hygienic, secure, socially and culturally acceptable, and also such that it provides privacy and dignity for users, while reaffirming at the same time that both the rights to water as well as the right to sanitation are rights that are components of the right to an adequate standard of living. So again, just emphasizing that these are two rights that are important as both connected but also independent rights. And you'll find that there's a broader impact of especially the right to sanitation on things like culture, on things like hygiene, on things like safety, and on issues around privacy and dignity. This is why it is important that when we have these conversations, we not only think about the right to water as all-encompassing, but we also look into the intricacies that exist from the perspective of the right to sanitation as well. Now, what is the legal basis for this right? So I've put in HRWS as a way of combining the human rights to water and sanitation. So the main legal basis for the rights are found or is found in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights as being recognized as a component of the right to an adequate standard of living. Again, we'll find that when we look at countries, there are examples of laws, whether in the constitution or national laws, or indeed policies within countries that recognize these rights, either expressly or implicitly. Now, the implicit recognition of the rights could come through any of the other rights which we already identified. So adequate standard of living, health, a healthy environment, dignity, things like that. But in practice, while sanitation is really broad, for instance, and goes beyond toilets, and while water is also very broad and goes beyond drinking to even include the use of water for other domestic purposes, or indeed for even productive purposes, when we think about the human rights to water and sanitation, we're specifically thinking especially around or on issues of drinking water, toilets, as well as hand washing or hygiene. There are also conversations around menstrual hygiene, which is also linked to sanitation. So these are some of the main issues that are covered within the broad framing of the human rights to water and sanitation. Now, you might hear people talk about human rights to water and sanitation principles. These principles include the fact that it has to be sufficient. Whatever service we provide for water and sanitation needs to be sufficient. It needs to be safe. It needs to be acceptable. It needs to be physically accessible, and it also has to be affordable. And on this slide, we find examples of some of the parameters that have been suggested by various international organizations as ways of measuring whether or not we are meeting up with the standards for each of these principles. In the final masterclass for this series, we will also be looking in more detail at the human rights to water and sanitation indicators. But for today, this is just to give us an idea of the ways in which different organizations approach the measurement or the calibration of the human rights to water and sanitation principles. So for sufficiency or for sufficient, sometimes people talk about adequate. The World Health Organization recommends that for water, we should have at least between 50 and 100 liters of water per person per day in order to meet basic needs and minimize health concerns. So this already gives us an indication that if people do not have access of up to 50 liters a day, then we're likely to have problems, especially from a health perspective. And of course, it's important to also emphasize that each of these depends on people's specific circumstances. So people in certain situations might require more water, whether because of health or because of their age or other contexts in which they find themselves. So for safety, we also find guidelines for drinking water quality, both at the international level, but also at the national and subnational levels. And very often these guidelines are to be seen as minimum standards that need to be reached. There's acceptability, which we already mentioned. And of course, what is acceptable would differ, especially in the context of sanitation from one jurisdiction to the other. So cultural practices, gender, life cycle, privacy are some of the issues that could affect what is acceptable in terms of sanitation. But for water, very often, because we already have those minimum standards and guidelines, that could also be a benchmark for ensuring that we're meeting acceptable standards. Also to mention that there are technical standards for sanitation facilities as well that we will find in different laws in various jurisdictions. Then the issue of physical accessibility, again, the WHO recommends that water sources should be within 1,000 meters of home, and there shouldn't be more than 30 minutes for collection time. So these are some of the ways in which we can check whether or not these principles are being recognized or are being implemented in practice. And for affordability, the United Nations Development Programme suggests that 3% of household income should be the limit for water costs. There are lots of debates around why 3%, why not less? What does 3% mean for a poorer household compared to a richer household? And should this also include sanitation, menstrual hygiene costs, or is it just about the direct water costs, or does it also include the cost of treatments and all of that? So these are some of the indications as to how these principles can be implemented in practice and how we can measure whether or not they're being achieved in practice. Now, the importance of the human rights to water and sanitation also include the legal obligations attached to the rights. Because it's a human right, then it is no longer a case of let's do this for the sake of charity or let's do this to help people, but it becomes a legal obligation. And that obligation includes the obligation to respect the rights. It includes the obligation to protect the rights. It includes the obligations to fulfill as well as promote the rights. Now, we're going to talk more about respect, especially because when we think about states, for instance, states have the duty of respect, protect, and fulfill. And they would also say promote, because if people do not know that they have a right, then chances are that they wouldn't even be able to demand that right for themselves. So it's important that they're aware, and that awareness comes with the duty to promote the rights. But beyond that, when it comes to non-state actors and other entities apart from states, there's also some duty which the human rights imposes. And this is the source of, this is the basis for the conversations around what obligations do institutions owe, or what obligations do corporations owe, or corporate entities and businesses, what obligations do they owe from a human rights perspective. And as we'll see in the next few slides, a lot of the conversations for businesses, for corporate organizations are around the duty to respect. On the other hand, the legal obligations which the human rights impose also include the procedural aspects to it. So things around ensuring that people have access to information and there's transparency in the governance of water and sanitation, ensuring that people are able to participate in the governance process, and ensuring that there's sustainability as well. Beyond that, also ensuring, especially from the perspective of the states, that there is no retrogression in progress towards realizing access to water and sanitation, or towards realizing universal coverage. Now, a lot of the conversations are around progressive realization. And what does that mean? It means that there is a recognition that realizing the rights to water and sanitation will be incremental, will be progressive. But at the same time, there is the duty to ensure that there's no retrogression. So this then means that as we move and as we make progress towards realizing access to water and sanitation as human rights, we also have to ensure that we are closing the gap between those who have and those who do not have. Because if that gap isn't being closed, even when we expand coverage, we might actually end up providing more for those who already have and leaving behind those who do not have at all. And that goes against the tenets of the human rights obligations, but it also goes against even the International Framework for Development, which is very much focused on ensuring that we do not leave anyone behind. The other legal obligation is around ensuring that we apply the maximum available resources. And this is quite broad in that the duty doesn't only cover ensuring that we apply the maximum financial resources, but it could be other forms of resources as well. So the maximum available resources need to be employed to achieve human rights goals. Now, this is a slide which essentially shows us the way we have traveled from discussions around the rights to water and sanitation, or specifically starting from the rights to water as part of the adequate standard of living within the context of General Comments number 15 as far back as 2002 to 2015, when we then had the SDG agenda, recognizing the need for ensuring universal access to clean water and sanitation. Now, we also had the MDGs, which predates the SDGs. And of course, with the MDGs, we know that the focus was more on developing countries. But with the SDGs, we're now focused on a global goal, which ensures that everybody everywhere is able to realize access to clean water and sanitation. Now, how do these two come together, the SDGs and the human rights, and especially thinking about SDG 6 and the human rights to water and sanitation? We'll find that SDG 6.1, which is the SDG that's focused on water, speaks to universal and equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water for all. And SDG 6.2, which is more about sanitation and hygiene, speaks to access to adequate and equitable sanitation and hygiene for all, and end to open defecation, paying special attention to the needs of women and girls and those in vulnerable situations. So if we look at those elements that I have underlined, like universal, equitable access, affordable, adequate, and vulnerable situations, that already shows some connections between the human rights principles for water and sanitation, as well as the SDG goal for water and sanitation. So to a very large extent, SDG 6 captures most of the criteria or principles of the human rights to water and sanitation. But if we look closely and we compare the indicators for SDG 6 and the human rights, we find that there are still some gaps. So we cannot think, or we cannot accept that once we achieve SDG 6, we have automatically achieved the human rights to water and sanitation, because there are synergies, there are similarities, but there are still distinct human rights to water and sanitation indicators, principles, and normative elements that aren't captured, and especially when we look at the targets for water and sanitation under the SDGs. So this is something that we have to be clear about and also mindful of. Again, bearing in mind that while the human rights to water and sanitation imposes a binding legal duty, the SDGs do not necessarily impose the same level of legal obligation. So that in itself is a reason for us to champion the clear express recognition of the rights to water and sanitation at the international level, but also at the national and subnational levels. So moving on to corporate due diligence concerns, specifically in relation to water and sanitation. To start with, what is corporate due diligence? There are lots of literature and conversations around what corporate due diligence means and why it is important. But specifically in relation to our conversation today, we're approaching corporate due diligence as involving that process of ensuring that companies identify, prevent, and actually mitigate potential, but also real adverse impacts from their operations, but also from their value chains as well, and account for how these impacts can be addressed. So corporate due diligence requires some level of proactivity. It's not just about waiting for the risk to occur, but it's about proactively thinking and identifying the ways in which risks to human rights, but also risks to the environment can be present in the operations of a business, and how these can be managed in a way that ensures that they do not come to be. But even when they happen, measures need to be put in place to also ensure that those adverse impacts are addressed and the victims are supported in a way that doesn't continue to violate their human rights by perpetuating those adverse impacts. The kinds of issues that are covered within the context of corporate due diligence are quite broad. There are examples which we will look into of laws in various jurisdictions which mandates corporate due diligence, but it's not always the case that it is mandatory. But looking at the various examples, we find that some of the issues covered within corporate due diligence concerns include the quality and impact of products and services on humans, but also on the environment, the need to protect consumer rights, employee and industrial relations, issues around bribery and corruption, various business relations within the operations of the business, but also across the value chain, and how these impact on rights, on the environment, on consumers, as well as employees, as well as the needs to communicate action to address these impacts. So these are some of the concerns broadly that are covered within the scope of corporate due diligence laws and corporate due diligence policies. This also means that where we have a situation in which the law isn't necessarily called the corporate due diligence law, but it covers any of these concerns, then we could perhaps explore ways of applying such laws to advance corporate due diligence, even in the absence of a mandatory duty on the businesses to comply with corporate due diligence obligations. At the international level, there is a framework for corporate due diligence. Now, most of the instruments at that level are soft law and non-binding, which means that they are not necessarily imposing a binding legal duty. One of the main frameworks which people talk about at the international level in relation to corporate due diligence, corporate accountability, is United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Of course, there are lots of opinions on this framework and the utility of it, but it represents an important framework at the international level, which clearly recognizes the duty of businesses, of corporations in relation to human rights and the environment, and also tries to lay out principles for ensuring that that duty can be implemented in practice. So it provides guidelines for moving things forward at the national and subnational levels. One of the main principles or the core principles which we find within the context of the UNGP is that states have a duty to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights and fundamental freedoms. So even when we go into this conversation around corporate due diligence, what can businesses do in order to ensure that they respect human rights, they do not violate human rights in their operations and in their value chains, we are not by any way or in any way saying that or relieving states of their core responsibilities to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights, no. But it is just a way of ensuring that while states are achieving that, other actors, other stakeholders are also contributing to advancing human rights. So within that context, another core principle for corporate due diligence under the UNGP is a recognition of the role of all business enterprises as specialized organs of society performing specialized functions that are also required to comply with all applicable laws and to respect human rights. And within the context of the water and sanitation sector, where we find businesses, corporations, non-state actors playing important roles as service providers, it then means that the human rights obligations also apply to them in a way that ensures that they are complying with the applicable laws and they are respecting the human rights in their operations and in the ways in which they deliver their services or indeed their goods in connection with the rights to water and sanitation. A third core principle is that the states and other actors involved in the process have to ensure that there is access to effective remedies for breach of human rights obligations, such that where the measures that have been put in place to mitigate any adverse impacts fail, and there's actually a risk or there's a real adverse impact on human rights of people, then those people who are affected are provided with mechanisms, approaches, remedies through which they can actually get some form of recourse for whatever obligations have been breached or for whatever violations they have suffered. And this could include both judicial remedies, but also non-judicial remedies. The essential elements being that those remedies are effective. And of course, being effective would also mean that not only would they provide redress and remedies to those who have suffered, but they act as some deterrent for further violations by other actors as well. So the conversations around mandatory corporate due diligence is essentially based on the idea that all of these frameworks exist, especially at the international level, which recognize the importance of state accountability and indeed even provide some guidance as to how we can hold states accountable. But even so, there are still lots of instances where we have seen corporations, businesses being involved in human rights violations, either directly or indirectly. And in the absence of a binding legal duty or in the absence of a binding obligation for corporate due diligence, the options for holding such businesses, such corporations accountable are limited. And based on that understanding, there's now this push for a mandatory duty to be recognized through laws at the national and subnational levels as well. And essentially, this arguments for mandatory corporate due diligence have been driven not only by states, but also by non-state actors such as civil society and also businesses themselves. Because not only does it provide a remedy in situations where businesses or corporations are involved in human rights violations, but also it provides investors and companies themselves with some protections against unfair competitive advantage, which results where it's a free-for-all, business as usual, and everybody is allowed to engage in practices which could result in human rights violations, but also offer some kind of advantage to people who engage in such practices, because there are no binding legal obligations and commensurate sanctions where human rights are violated. Another advantage of the mandatory corporate due diligence has been presented as greater transparency and access to justice for consumers. So overall, there are advantages of mandating corporate due diligence, not only from the perspective of the state as a regulator, but also from the perspective of civil society and representatives of users, communities, but also from the perspective of other businesses as well, and especially businesses who are invested or committed to ethical investments and ensuring that it contributes as good corporate citizens to promoting human rights and also sustainability goals in their operations. So some examples and some recent developments in relation to corporate due diligence laws. In 2015, the United Nations or United Kingdom's Modern Slavery Act was enacted. In 2017, we had the Corporate Duty of Vigilance law from France. In 2019, we had European Union level, where we had the European Commission Directive on Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence. Again, in 2022, the Norwegian Transparency Act entered into force. And then we also had the United States law against forced labor from a region in China, the Uyghur region. And in 2023, this year, we've had the German Federal Act on Corporate Due Diligence Obligations in Supply Chains entering into force. So these are some examples of recent developments which show increasing activity to ensure that corporations, businesses can be held accountable for corporate due diligence based on mandatory legal obligations in national laws. So in this next few slides, we have examples of what these laws entail. So what is required and for whom is it required? And it's a mixed bag, really. So within the context of the European Commission Directive, for instance, it covers large undertakings regulated by a member state of the EU or established within the EU, as well as publicly listed small and medium-sized undertakings or high-risk small and medium-sized undertakings. We also have it covering large undertakings and publicly listed small and medium-sized undertakings in high-risk sectors. So it's not only about the size of the business or the undertaking, as it's called in this directive, but it's also about where it is located, as well as the sector in which it operates. And these three parameters are commonly applied in all the different examples. So how is corporate due diligence mandated within the context of Europe? It requires companies to integrate and ensure that there is due diligence policy and processes within their operations. It also requires them to establish a strategy for identifying and addressing potential, but also actual impacts where they occur. And companies that are subject to the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive must publish their annual due diligence strategy. And companies that are not subject to it must also publish an annual statement. So essentially, in terms of who does this apply to, like I said, if we look at the other examples, we'll find that it's about the size of the business, it's about where it is located, where its operations occur, and sometimes it's also about its commercial value. So what is its turnover, and does that qualify it as a big business, which then has to be regulated? Or even where it's a small business, is it a small business that is operating or contributing to the operations of a large entity? And based on that connection, does it then have some liability, or does it then take on some responsibility for corporate due diligence because of the association with the larger business? And as to how it is done, it is about putting in place measures to identify the potential risks, ensuring that when the risks occur, they're also identified, addressing those risks, but also reporting on the measures that have been put in place and the actions that have been taken to address the risk. So these are all examples. And when we get the slides, we can go into a bit more detail about how it plays out in the different jurisdictions. Now, what are the prospects and limitations? As to the prospects of mandatory corporate due diligence, one of the main things would be that there's a legal obligation to prevent, but also to review and to report. And this is important because it then means that it is not required as a case of corporate social responsibility voluntarily, or as a case of philanthropy, but it is required as a binding legal duty. And that duty can be enforced against companies or businesses that do not comply. Another prospect is that it reverses the burden of proof, because corporate due diligence, in requiring the corporations or the eligible entities to report, that places the burden of proof on them, as against requiring outsiders who are not part of that organization to get the proof to show that the business has either defaulted or in a way violated human rights. So that reversal of the burden of proof in itself is also a prospect, which we find when corporate due diligence is required as a binding legal duty. Thirdly, there are liabilities for violations. That also improves the prospects of mandatory corporate due diligence. Fourthly, most of the laws regulate not only the direct operations of the eligible entities, but their supply chain as well. And through that, it ensures that even when small, medium-sized businesses that would ordinarily not be eligible under the laws, when they operate in relation to bigger companies, then they assume a duty as well, and that contributes to advancing corporate due diligence. And finally, another prospect of mandatory corporate due diligence is that some of the laws actually cover not only operations within the jurisdiction of the country or the home country, but also covers operations of the businesses in other jurisdictions. And that in itself contributes to advancing extraterritorial obligations and ensuring that companies that are very often from countries that are with stronger regulatory systems, those stronger regulatory systems could also benefit other jurisdictions that might not have similar regulations for corporate due diligence by regulating the operations of those businesses in the foreign jurisdictions. So essentially, in thinking about corporate due diligence within the water sector or within human rights to water and sanitation, we're thinking not only about the process in terms of what do the companies have to do, but we're thinking about the outcomes, and all of this is also connected to the vulnerabilities, because as we said, with the corporate due diligence laws, they very often require the corporations to think about how could the risks, what are the potential adverse impacts that could result from their operations, and that in itself requires looking at vulnerabilities and then putting in place measures to address those adverse potential adverse impacts is about the process. Reviewing that process and then reporting on it is also focused on the outcome. So all these elements come together and actually advance the human rights to water and sanitation. Sorry, I think there's a bit of background noise. I hope it's not too loud. And I think in relation to that, we already talked about the duty to respect, protect, fulfill, promote, but it also means that within the context of corporate due diligence, there's a duty not only for the corporations, but also for the state actors from the perspective of ensuring that there is regulation. And there's also a monitoring of compliance by the various corporations or businesses involved in the delivery of water and sanitation services. And that in itself is a way of promoting respect from corporate entities, but it also ensures that there is a remedy where violations occur and those who are affected can find some kind of recourse or some way of addressing the violations which they have experienced. So the essential elements of effective and equitable human rights and environmental due diligence legislation is a report, which I would encourage us all to look at, which really captures the main things we need to pay attention to in order to ensure that we develop due diligence legislations that actually promotes human rights, but also environmental sustainability in the real, like in practical terms. And during the workshop, we'll think in more details about the experiences which we've had in our various jurisdictions and the ways in which these already either exist or can be improved. Now, one of the elements identified in that report is that the legislation on corporate due diligence needs to ensure that corporations or eligible entities actually identify, assess, prevent, seize, mitigate, and effectively remedy potential and actual adverse impacts. Secondly, the system needs to be sufficiently harmonized to create a coherent transnational enforcement environment such that the different jurisdictions work together to promote an ecosystem in which corporate due diligence laws not only apply and address adverse and potential impacts, potential and actual adverse impacts within one jurisdiction, but also can benefit other jurisdictions as well. Thirdly, it is important to impose due diligence obligations that are aimed at protecting the state's good governance practices, in addition to protecting human rights and the planet, such that where good practices already exist, the corporate due diligence laws should enhance such practices. And finally, we want to be able to strike a balance between overly restrictive as well as unduly flexible measures. So in summary, with corporate due diligence in the context of the rights to water and sanitation and governance of the sector, we're thinking about assessing impacts, we're thinking about taking action, we're thinking about tracking the action, we're thinking about reporting on what that action is, and we're thinking about reviewing and improving the process continuously. I think with that, we've come to the end, and so we'll take the questions now. Thank you.
Hi, Patty. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. We have quite a few questions. Thank you to all the participants for submitting their questions. There was a question from Mohammed Nazim Nouri.
Thank you very much for that, Linear. And thanks for the question, Mohammed Nazim Nouri. How we involve the gender inclusion in water and sanitation and sharing the gender mainstreaming in Muslim countries. Thank you for that. So I think that's a very important question and agenda. And I think one of the ways to do that is to start with that we have a clear understanding of what the figures are. So gender inclusion would be about ensuring that the data that we're capturing is not only capturing data on access in urban and rural areas, broadly speaking, but is also capturing the gender dimensions in terms of, firstly, who are the women involved in the process, or women and girls? Does the policy, does the law recognize women and girls and their specific needs? Are the women and girls involved in the actual governance of the resource? Are they involved in the policy-making process? Are they contributing to the monitoring process? Are their voices and their interests represented? And do they also have the resources that they need to be able to satisfy their water and sanitation needs as well, you know? So those are some of the ways. So it's about looking at the governance process, it's about looking at the policies, it's about looking at the ways in which we are measuring and monitoring progress as well. I hope that answers the question, Mohammed Nassim Nouri.
Thank you, Patty. Then we have another question from Almotazem. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Perhaps, I'm not sure if you have context about this case study, but if you do not, please let us know, Patty, then we can move on to the next question. So his question was about the Arthubian Dam. Is it legal to allow for other countries to use So I think this is a transboundary water issue.
Okay.
But if you have it, yeah.
Thank you very much. I mean, I do not have specifics for that case. And what I would say is, to start with, there would be rules or laws on transboundary water governance. And if there isn't, then that's something that needs to be looked at. And there are principles for equitable sharing of resources, equitable utilization of resources, and ensuring that irrespective of whether you're upstream, you're downstream, the rights to water for those communities that are dependent on those resources are recognized and are met. So those principles in themselves, the international water principles, would ordinarily be a way to start in terms of ensuring that we are having equitable allocation and access to the resources, and we're not violating the human rights of people, in the ways in which we manage the dams or whatever other shared resources that there are. So I can't speak specifically to this case, but I would say that if we want to know whether it is legally, being managed properly, then the first question would be, is there an instrument in place that regulates access to that resource? And looking at the instruments in place, does it comply with the international water law principles for ensuring equitable access and utilization of shared resources?
Thank you, Patty. Now we'll move on to the next one. There's a question, it's more of a comment, I think, from Beda Chowdhury. I think an emerging sector aspect, along with all other sectors affected by access to water, is climate migration. So perhaps you can share your thoughts on that.
Thank you very much, Beda Chowdhury. And I think that's a very important question or comment. And climate migration is something that I'm really interested in as well. So yes, it is an important issue, and it is something that has very clear implications for access to water as well. I'm not sure in what way you want us to talk about it, but it says that lines of access to water is climate migration. So if what you mean is that lack of access to water or droughts is a cause of migration and should be recognized as such, then I agree with you. But there are also discussions or issues around what then happens. How do we manage that migration process, especially when people cross state borders into other countries? Are they recognized as refugees, or are they not recognized as refugees? And is there a case for now recognizing climate change as a major cause of displacements, and as perhaps one of the reasons for which people can then be rendered homeless and people can become refugees and should enjoy the protections under the international refugee laws and humanitarian laws? So is there a need to have that conversation? Yes. And is it something that, is there a gap? Yes, there is a gap. And is water or lack of access to water a reason or one of the factors that contributes to climate change or related or induced migration? Yes. So my answer to all of those are yes, yes, yes. And it's something that we need to talk a bit more about. Thank you.
Thank you, Patty. I think we have a few more minutes for 2 or 3 questions. Okay, there's a question from Emiliano. I think he was also at the previous masterclass. Thanks for joining us again. So his question is, what means recognize the rights implicitly in the constitution of some countries? I'm not sure if you, yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for that question, Emiliano Alcaraz. So implicit recognition essentially is that the Constitution does not directly recognize the right to water or the right to sanitation, but in recognizing other rights that are connected, for instance, the right to an adequate standard of living, or in some instances, the right to life, the courts are able to then say that you cannot realize the right to life, which is recognized in the Constitution, without also ensuring that you respect the right to water. And for that reason, we then say that it is implicitly recognized. So essentially, implicit recognition means that even in the absence of a direct or express recognition of the right to water or the right to sanitation in the Constitution. Other existing human rights guarantees or provisions can form the basis for holding the government accountable or holding other actors accountable and ensuring that the rights to water and sanitation are recognized. So it's otherwise indirect recognition.
Thank you, Patty. So now there's a question, it's a quite broad one, so I'll leave this to you. So what is the current status of the right to water and sanitation in developing countries? And then how can we constrain the governments to ensure the right to water and sanitation?
Okay, thank you very much. So in terms of the current status, if you mean about recognition in laws, then it's difficult to say. It will vary from one country to the other. So in some countries, like in South Africa, you could have it clearly spelled out in national laws saying, look, everyone has a right to water, everyone has a right to sanitation. In other countries, it is not clearly spelled out in the constitution, but you could have other laws that actually recognize the need to protect the rights to water. So it varies in terms of the formal recognition in national legal instruments. But in terms of actual realization, again, there's a mixed picture, but very many developing countries are in situations where we do not have universal coverage or universal access. So there's a problem there as well. So there's room for improvement in terms of formal recognition in the laws. There's also lots of room for improvement in terms of universal coverage in practical terms, especially for people in vulnerable situations.
There's a similar question about how much has SDG-6 been achieved around the world? Do we have any statistics country-wise? What are the obligations to achieve SDG-6?
Yes, indeed. So the SDGs website has the reports on SDG-6, and it also has a lot of interactive information on country data as well. But generally, in terms of access to water, there are at least 2 billion people, or 26% of the global population, lacking safely managed drinking water services. And the figures for sanitation are higher. So we have around 46% of the global population without access to safely managed sanitation services, and another 29% without hand washing facilities with soap at home. And I would say that that in itself actually doesn't give us the full picture, because those figures are only about the so-called safely managed services. Thank you very much for that, Lino. Whereas when we look at the human rights to water and sanitation and we look at the principles, we see that it is more extensive and covers even more aspects than the SDG indicators. So I would say that the figures are higher than we would even find in the SDG reports. And Leonor has kindly shared with us a link through which we can see the current figures. Thank you.
Thank you, Patty. So I'll just like to thank you all for joining us today, as well as Dr. Patty Obani, who provided us with such an insightful presentation, as well as her opinion and expertise to your questions. So thank you very much, and we hope to see you at the next masterclass next week.
Thanks, everyone.